In this episode, we consider whether sports gambling, particularly sports gambling through mobile apps, may be going too far in light of a recent lawsuit filed in federal court going after one of the sports books for basically taking advantage of someone's gambling addiction. We'll also react to the misinformation surrounding the FEMA hurricane relief, which followed, coincidentally or not coincidentally, 100 plus Republicans in Congress voting against the FEMA funding. Hello, welcome to the Call It Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and joining me today is a man who on a good day, you may catch busting loose. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, you ready to show us your own special kind of funk today?
No, that would be an extremely good day. If you catch me busting loose, those don't happen often. So,
all right.
I'll just bust something else, but not,
Yeah, you're getting old, huh, man?
Yeah, I am.
Something busting loose might not be a good thing for you.
Yeah. Might not be able to walk.
Yeah.
Got back pain, so we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, for sure. But we're recording this on October 15th, 2024. And we recently saw a $250 million lawsuit filed by a former employee of the Jacksonville Jaguars of the National Football League against FanDuel, which is one of the huge mobile app sports books. And this is based in large part on claims that the sports book exploited his gambling addiction and by doing so failed to follow its own policies, whether it be responsible gambling or money laundering and so forth. And now this former employee, Amit Patel, is currently serving a 6.5 year sentence in federal prison because he was previously convicted of charges related to stealing $22 million from the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's not coming into the fight, with clean hands here. He's going after FanDuel, but he's a convicted, like someone who's already stole a bunch of money based on his gambling addiction. I don't know if that gives him less or more credibility in this situation, but the fact that this is happening on its own without trying to figure out somebody's a white knight and, somebody's the person who's the villain here, just that question, it raises the question itself on whether the mobile apps, particularly what we know about how mobile apps operate and to try to, have addictive qualities and so forth, whether it be social media or whatever, whether they may be going too far in terms of what's happening with gambling, which has recently exploded over the last few years. So Tunde, what are your thoughts on the lawsuit and the claim that FanDuel was at least partially responsible for this guy losing all this money, stealing all this money because they were exploiting his gambling addiction?
I think this is a kind of a fascinating case, actually. On the surface, it looks interesting, but once you start asking these deeper questions about, things like addiction, how companies deal with people that may have these things. And like you said, this is a guy who's stole $22 million. So, I'm also reading about it. I'm thinking, okay, is this guy just looking for any way to get out of jail, or maybe make his time when he gets out of jail? Because like you said, he's currently serving. Make all of this effort a little bit better, because if he can get a percentage of that $250 million, lawsuit, then hey, he recoups some of the money that he stole.
Yeah,
and I'm sure
he could just get a settlement.
So to me, that's why this does on the surface, it kind of looks one way, but when you start really diving into these layers, which I know is why we found this an interesting discussion for our show, it does get very interesting. So yeah, it's and also as you're talking, this is one thing because you're an attorney, just for me to put out there because I'm not an attorney. It's almost laughable sometimes. I hear like these lawsuits that the amount of the thing that the damages someone's seeking. It's like $250 million. Like, where'd that number come from?
Yeah,
he stole $22 million. Like,
what I mean? Well, just the technical piece about that is there's the damages, as in like the harm, and then he's also seeking what are called punitive damages, which are intended to be, but those are supposed to be high because what punitive damages, the point of that is to create a deterrence amongst that company and other companies in the industry, saying, hey, not only we're going to make you compensate somebody for the actual harm that you caused, we want to make this so serious to you that you and everyone else in your industry sees that, we as the society are not going to play by this, so the punitive damages piece is where you get the inflated number. But some of that also is just to create a negotiating stance to where you start here. And then if you're going to start negotiating and settlement, most civil lawsuits in federal court end up settling by far, so you start with this high number. So the high number does a lot of things. And then it also creates a better headline, so you're going to get more coverage. So that's happening, on underneath all of this, kind of the machinations. And you're right. I mean, that's stuff that I see that and I have all those thoughts, but those all may not be and they probably aren't just kind of intuitive to anybody who sees that. To me, though, just kind of on the mechanics of it, part of it that stood out to me was I threw out in the intro is that I'm wondering, what I was trying to figure out was the fact that this guy was convicted, of fraud, basically, of stealing all this money from his employer. Does that make him more credible or less credible here? Because normally if somebody's convicted of a crime of dishonesty, it's like, oh, well, that person is a liar, a cheater, so people who lie and cheat, generally speaking in society, I mean, this is kind of getting broken nowadays, but generally speaking, if somebody's known to tell lies and stuff like that, then you hold the next thing that they say and the future things that they say with less credibility. It's like, oh, well, yeah, he said this, but this person lies all the time. So, or this person has a history of lying. So does the fact that this person has a history of deceit make him less credible here, which would be the norm, or the fact that this guy, if you look into it a little more closely, he was acting so like what he got convicted of, it was so egregious. It's like this guy wasn't even really trying to get away with this stuff. He looks like a compulsive, like the conduct that he was convicted of looks like someone who can't control themselves. It's like, oh, this guy, you weren't slick. You weren't trying to get away with this. You couldn't help yourself. And so that almost makes it seem like maybe he was, maybe between the app and what was happening with the app. And then also, if you look into the case a little bit, they were contacting him when he wouldn't place a bet on a day, then FanDuel would email him or text him and say, hey man, what happened yesterday? You gonna bet? Like, it's like, okay, so maybe they were, egging him on in a way that would have him do this egregious kind of these egregious acts out in the open because he just couldn't help himself. And so that piece, because it defies or at least questions the normal expectations, made this interesting to me. But then also and then we can get into some of the nuance or the detail if you want, which is just some of that stuff's pretty interesting. One of them being that I originally read the headline. I'm like, okay, yeah, so they're using the note, all the things that we know that social media apps do to make things more addictive as far as infinite scroll, notifications and stuff. I assume, okay, yeah, they're doing that stuff. But FanDuel was going beyond that and actually calling this dude. They had a guy assigned to be this guy's liaison. They were flying him out to all these nice trips and stuff like that. And it's like, so they were doing a lot more than just designing an app to be addictive. So, I mean, what about in the detail, if anything, stood out to you as far as that?
No, that part of it stood out a lot to me. And that's where I was going to go as well with some of the nuances here. Like, because it's interesting. So you're right. He had a VIP host, is what they called it.
Yeah.
And that gentleman's job was to court Mr. Patel and make sure that he kept being a great customer. I mean, it's regular business 101, right? Just he's a concierge in a sense. And so that's to me where this becomes very interesting because, like many other discussions we've had, not just you and I, but I'm saying our society has had in the last probably 10 years, is the infiltration of big tech and the ability to influence people's behavior with a device that's in the palm of their hand, which is much different than, let's say, a television that's static in someone's living room or a newspaper or other forms of communication that we used to get as consumers from companies. Let's just put it that way. And so what it got me thinking, James, which is interesting, is because I started thinking like, okay, so let's see other environments where there could be risks of an addict getting worse or people that aren't exposed to it becoming addictive. So I thought about things like alcohol, that industry. I thought about tobacco. You're thinking about, things like that, right?
Yeah.
And I thought like, yeah, would we be okay with like, Jack Daniels or Philip Morris kind of having data about who drinks the most or who smokes a more packs of cigarettes. And then if someone, was taking 3-4 days off from drinking, that the representatives of Brown-Forman, the parent company of Jack Daniels and other brands, just calling, have some VIP guy call and say, hey man, how come you didn't have a drink today?
Hey man, let me fly you out to this big party.
Yeah, exactly. Where we got bottles waiting for you, man. What you doing? and imagine the same thing with tobacco.
I thought the same thing. Imagine having an alcohol or a concierge for somebody who's an alcoholic. An alcohol concierge. It's hold up, that doesn't sound right.
Correct. And that's what I mean. Tobacco, same thing. If someone did not smoke a pack a day, that they started getting harassed by Philip Morris. Well, how come you weren't smoking today? And the thing I thought of
is... You could say harassed, but it could also just be prodded. Hey, man, don't you didn't smoke as much yesterday. You want me to
that's why cigarettes? That's why I wanted to bring that up, because I think you and I and most of the people watching us today can appreciate that seems a little bit out of the norm if we were to do that or see companies do that. And it's because now I'm thinking of, okay, well, that would be a company then promoting things that we already accept and consider very unhealthy long term. We know smoking cigarettes, heavily is bad. We know drinking heavy leads to other factors, health wise and family wise and all that. And I think just gambling is one of those things because there's not a visual victim. There's that you don't get lung cancer from it. You don't go home and beat your wife over it. With excessive drinking.
One for you. I got one for you. I had a similar thought. But the example I had in my mind was a different example. It was porn. Imagine if
same thing,
somebody has this a porn app, and then if you're not watching it enough,
calling you up hey man, you didn't watch 6 hours of porn today. What's going on?
Your porn consumption has gone down over the past couple of days, man. What's up? Let me fly you to this porn convention. Let me send some more porn. But
here's why it's a good conversation for society, because both porn and gambling, unlike cigarettes and alcohol,
that's what I was going to
say. The damage, so they all can do damage. And I think it's a great conversation about addiction, because if you're addicted to porn and gambling, you're going to mess up something in your life anyway, just personal relationships. Maybe you're going to lose too much money on those things, whatever the case is. And maybe you're not going to get a direct health issue like lung cancer or heart disease, like you would from too much drinking or smoking. But the effect, there's still an effect that's negative on the human and on their surrounding environment that they're in.
I don't think you need to. That's the concept of that is addictive behavior. Addictive things that are potentially addictive can then create ripple effects in your life. And the substances is an example, but the reason I like the comparison to the porn, we talked about OnlyFans a couple weeks ago. It's like if OnlyFans had a system like this, where if you aren't viewing it enough, then they start contacting you and stuff like that. I think the question alone,
marriage. What do you think?
I think the question of, like I said, I came into this thinking we were going to be talking about notifications on the app and stuff like that, things that are meant to prod you to go back and open the app again and stuff like that. And, but this was even more egregious than that. So, I think that I came into this skeptical of this guy's kind of approach and the claim. I came out of it saying, hey, whether this guy needs to win the lawsuit, quote unquote, or settle, yada, 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 this is something society should be looking at. And so therefore this lawsuit should be does serve an important purpose to get us to look at this kind of stuff, not just even in this gambling context, but I would say even with now, and this goes into your industry, into the stock apps and so forth, because those again, when we're talking about things that potentially can be done in a compulsory manner, and then companies know that it can be done in a compulsory manner, and people kind of lose control, and then they prey on that. They see that as, they see it as a business opportunity, but they see it as a weakness. Hey, we can manipulate this person. We can get this person on a hook and then reel them in continually to the bottom line of our business, the benefit of that. It's, that's something that we as a society should take a look at as far as how far we are going to, from a regulatory standpoint, allow these companies to go. Because again, can you do these concierge type stuff if you have these these compulsory type behaviors? Can you, how much can you do the notifications and so forth? We're pretty much kind of hands off on a lot of that stuff when it comes to a lot of whether it be social media or anything like that. Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. So now, last question on this, and because I do want to look at the piece of this from the standpoint of, does this case, like the fact that he is a convicted, that he's a convicted criminal in terms of stealing money, do you think that itself is something that helps or hurts his case, in the sense that if this was just a victim, but a victim who looked better, like, hey, I'm not a liar, I'm not a cheater, yada yada yada, but this is what's doing this to me, does that undermine the person's credibility that the company's conduct made them lose control? Like, is this an upside down world where the kind of the non-clean victim ends up being a better person to complain about this? What do you think about that? Like, if you were on a jury, how would you see that person? Do you look in and say, look, man, you still shouldn't have stole, because you stole that money, I don't want you to prevail here, or is it like, oh, because you stole that money, clearly you were being taken advantage of? What do you think about that? Like, just from how it turns that upside down? Or potentially.
Yeah, I just, it's interesting, because I'm sure that's going to be each of us personally assessing the situation and looking at the person that's been convicted or whatever, shown that they've done something wrong, and just assessing what do we think about that.
Let me throw something in real quick, because that's a really interesting point. Because I'm looking at it just from a strategy and a gamification standpoint. But you're right, it ultimately does come down to the individual. And what it might end up lead to, honestly, is kind of like a confirmation bias thing. Like, whatever if you read all this or hear all this and be like, yeah, FanDuel's going too far, then you'll probably look at that guy as a good plaintiff. And then if you go in and say, nah, that, I don't think that the apps have gone too far, then you might look at him, and then you look at his background and start saying, well, those are the reasons why this is something that should be, kicked out.
Well, one of the things that got me thinking about this, I mean, not to go off topic here, but it's just because this is something everyone listening will understand, is look at Donald Trump and his legal cases. I thought of something similar, which is you have someone that's been accused of doing something wrong and there's evidence of it, but yet there's some truth to the fact that, has the government always been fair and how it's prosecuted people and all that? No, that there's evidence behind that as well. So when there's a little bit of truth on both sides, right, it makes it, that's where the confirmation bias things set in. And that's
some of that, though, can be misleading, though, because prosecutors' discretion is just a known thing in the law. But a skillful person in terms of crafting narratives will use that and say, hey, this discretion is being used unfairly, which
I know. But I mean,
there have been people from a civil rights standpoint that have been saying that for decades. Like, yo, you guys prosecute crimes.
Well, that's why I didn't want to go into a tangent, but just saying something that everyone could relate to.
You brought it up, so I want to say one thing with that, though, because I think it's a related thing. Like, it's the same concept, though, of where someone, depending on where you come down on a person, and you could use Trump as an example of this, if a person is accused of 30 crimes by 4 or 5 different people or 4 or 5 different jurisdictions, and you're accused of all these things and indicted, so it's not just accusations. There's probable cause. There's there's a reasonable case here going on. Some people would look at that and say that must be a bad guy, because who gets accused of that many things by that many different people who aren't working together and aren't in the same thing. Other people might look at that, depending on what they think. It all depends on what they think of the person, and be like, oh, that person's just being unfairly targeted because all these independent people are coming down on them. And so you either can walk away saying, oh, this person's being targeted, or, yeah, man, that guy must be really bad if he's committing crimes all over the place, so to speak.
Yeah, well, so and that's where I'm getting back now to the gentleman at hand with the sports betting thing, which is it's too, because we know that companies, especially with this online stuff and going through the phones and the apps, do prey on people. It can become addictive. They know how to deal with the human psyche and how to make the colors right and all this stuff to keep us on it. And like we're saying, there was a guy, they even had a concierge for the guy to egg him on. And why aren't you gambling? So in that sense, there's some truth there that the company is probably pushing a bit more than we're used to seeing in an area that we know historically has attracted addicts, right? People with addictive mindsets. And then you're right. On the other side, we got a guy who stole $22 million from his employer. And one could make the argument that, he did it because he was addicted and because this thing drove it into it. Or he's making all these claims and trying to sue for $250 million because he got busted stealing 22 and he spent it all on chasing girls in Miami and buying flashy cars. So, that's my point of saying that it's difficult, because I think it does come into then what do we think about all these other factors? And one of the things that I just wanted to get with this, because it's interesting as you were talking, it made me realize that with other things, like we're talking about specifically tobacco and alcohol, remember, there was a time when those were new to industry as well. Tobacco's been around and alcohol has been around for hundreds or if not thousands of years, but they were industrialized just really in the last 100 to 150 years. And so once that happened, industry gets their hands on it, and then they enhance certain things that make it either more refined, more addictive, more dangerous in its outcome, whether health-wise or dealing with other people. Then the government had to say, okay, this is affecting society, and that's when there started to become a regulatory framework around alcohol and tobacco and things like that. And I think this is an example where this internet stuff and the way that humans relate to online activity is still so fresh that I think we should be prepared to see more cases like this that are kind of in this weird zone where, on the surface it kind of looks, and you start looking deeper and it's like, well, yeah, should a company
until we sort it out, basically.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
We seem to have sorted out kind of what alcohol and tobacco companies are, how they're allowed to advertise, how they're not allowed to advertise, and stuff like that. Because they're not able to do everything that they want to do. Like the things they were doing much more from a marketing promotion standpoint 50 years ago than they do now. Because they had to be reeled in because of not the exact same thing here, but kinds of things like this where it was creating pressure points in society that overall society was like, all right, that's a little too much. So that's really the kind of, to your point, that's the wrestling match that we're having right here. One thing I did want to provide an answer to the question I throw to you. And I think that objectively, and which does objectively doing a lot of work here, it helps from a case standpoint. As long as his bad behavior or any bad behavior that's brought in only relates to the gambling stuff that we're talking about here. Like it doesn't help if in college he stole a little bit here, or like some other time. Like if he has a history of deceit or lying, that it goes beyond this confined area of gambling and gambling adjacent activities, dealing with even more so if it's only dealing with this app, or any gambling app, then I think it may help his case, because it's like, look, this guy was a like I'm now talking about a lawyer. Yeah. This guy was a lawyer, was an angel, going around, the valedictorian in his class and all this kind of stuff. And then he got a hold of this app. This app pops up on his phone, and then he becomes this degenerate, and then if you build that case versus, hey man, this guy was crossing lines and all that kind of stuff, ever since he was 18, and then so I think that then it undermines.
This guy was at P. Diddy's freak offs, we got his phone. We see him texting with Jeff Epstein and Diddy. This guy was all over the place.
Exactly. So, and then it would hurt him. So I think the swing basically is like, it's not neutral. It's not neutral. It either helps him if it represents a break from who he was before, and it hurts him if it represents a consistency from who he was before. So that may be more legal analysis I wanted to get into in this, but it's still, again, it's interesting how that same fact can swing so far one way or the other. So no, but I think it's something that we should monitor, because, with gambling being opened up, over the past few years, in so many states, and then particularly it's not just gambling in sports books where you got to go physically be there, or even where you got to call somebody. It's like, this thing is on your phone, and you can swing wildly up and down in the course of the day and so forth. And we know from just past history that has created issues. And a lot of people talked about, what issues is going to create with the integrity of the game, and whether the players get tied up and stuff. And that stuff is real too, but just private citizens as well. Like how is this going to affect us, and whether or not any guardrails are going to need to be put up. And then, that's what I think you put it well. Like that's kind of what this is a part of the negotiation process of that, So yeah, I mean, it's something interesting. We'll keep an eye on it. I think that we close up this topic from here. We'll have a second topic. We hope that you join us for that as well. And we'll talk to you then.